Hello, y'all. Welcome to the show. This is Emotional Badass, where Moxie meets mindful. I'm your host, life coach and psychotherapist, Nikki Eisenhower. And on today's episode, I'm interviewing Andrea Dunlop and Mike Weber, authors of the book, The Mother Next Door. We're going to discuss Munchausen by proxy and what it means to move through this issue through the court systems. Thank you for joining our talk. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Light and love, and on to the show. I'm very excited to host this interview for all of our audience. I hope that y'all share this episode far and wide. I'm here with Andrea and Mike. Andrea Dunlop is the author of 4 novels, including She Regrets Nothing and Women Are the Fiercest Creatures. She's the host and the creator of Nobody Should Believe Me, an award-winning investigative true crime podcast about Munchausen by proxy. Mike Weber has 40 years, so much time in law enforcement, y'all, 40 years of law enforcement experience, including 15 years as a crimes against children investigator. Detective Weber has consulted with numerous police agencies and district attorneys' offices nationally on cases of medical child abuse. He was awarded the 2016 NCMEC Texas Hero for Children Award. I was able to get an advanced copy to do this interview of this book. This is the book, The Mother Next Door. It was fantastic, and it was really a healing journey for me. I have been a crime victim. I pressed charges against my father for the abuse he perpetrated against me, my siblings, and a childhood friend. I've been through the process as a victim. I've seen what happens in court. I felt how it feels. And Mike and Andrea are out there putting this work out into the world. I do believe that we are in a time period where we are going to see more and more and more Munchausen's cases. Munchausen's in and of itself is making myself sick. Munchausen's by proxy is making another that's under my care sick, a child or an elderly person or someone with a disability. Because of the attention seeking online, we are going to see more and more and more of these behaviors. I hope that this episode illuminates how you can be part of the solution. We all are, in a sense, mandatory reporters. If you have that in your heart, it may not be the law in your state. For me, every adult is a mandatory reporter, and you may change the life of a child in your sphere when you show up with courage to report. On to the show. All right, welcome, welcome. I am so glad to be on. Thank you so much, Mike and Andrea, for coming on and doing this with me.
Thank you so much for having us, Nikki. It's great to be back.
Yes,
Yay.
thank you, Nikki.
Yay, yay, yay. So I am so excited about this book. It is The Mother Next Door. You did an amazing job writing this book, Andrea. I will bet everything I have in my bank account, it is going to be a bestseller. And it needs to be. It really, really needs to be. So let's kind of get into it. Tell the audience, like, what is the book about? And let's talk about both of your contributions to this piece of work.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for the kind words, first of all. Yeah, the book is about, well, it's really a lot about my fantastic co-author, Detective Mike Weber. It came out of the two of us meeting almost 5 years ago now at the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children's annual conference in San Diego, where Mike was one of the speakers at a day-long Munchausen by proxy training that I attended. And I was also there to meet with the Munchausen by proxy committee that I am now a member of. And it was really, this was also where the idea for my podcast, Nobody Should Believe Me, came from. It was all out of this very fateful trip to San Diego. And I heard Detective Mike presenting with Sheriff Wayburn, who is the father of a survivor, which is one of the cases that we talk about in the book. And I just thought, at that point, I I had the story from my own family's experience with Munchausen by proxy, and that was the only one that I knew of. And as soon as I started hearing all of these other stories from Mike and from our other colleagues on the committee, I just thought this is the human face of this abuse that people really need to see in order to care about it and to understand what a strong pattern there is in these cases, and just understand that it's real and that it happens much more than most people understand that it happens. And so that was really just a moment of inspiration. And, talk about this in the introduction, but really like the minute I met Mike, because I introduced myself and said, I was coming into it with a long history in book publishing and as a novelist myself. And so he said kind of, aw shucks, like people are always telling me, and I would love to hear this moment from your perspective too, Mike, because, people are always telling me I should write a book. And I was like, no, you should write a book. Like you have this really extraordinary career and this incredible, expertise on this subject that just almost nobody else really has expertise in. And so lo and behold, here we are five years later with the book in our hands.
Yeah, and from my perspective of that, when I talked to Andrea that day, and I found out who she was, what she had done in the publishing industry, and writing a book, and I said that to her. It became, I don't know if at that moment, Andrea, but pretty soon after that, I'm like, she needs to write this with me, but she needs to actually come to that realization. I can't do that. So Andrea was very helpful. I tried to write it myself, and it was very much on this date I went here, I did this. On this date I went here and did this, because I'm a cop. That's what we do, right? That's how we document. And thankfully, I guess probably maybe about 4 months in.
Yeah, it was a few months. And so my original idea was like, okay, I'll help Mike with his book proposal and kind of give him some guidance and introduce him to my agent. And I immediately had this idea where I was like, I should just write it with him. But a thing about me is that I have a tendency to get excited about my ideas and then just take on a lot, and sort of jump headfirst into things without necessarily thinking about my bandwidth or questions of that nature. So I was trying to sort of not do that. But then, as we were just talking more and I was getting to know Mike, and this was when I was really first starting to put together the idea for the podcast as well. And Mike is a big contributor on the podcast, and particularly the first 2 seasons were all his cases. And I just thought, oh, this is just like a collaboration that makes so much sense. And so then I just called him up and I said, Mike, what would you think about, if we wrote this book together? And he was excited about that idea. And yeah, so here we are. It was pretty early on, I think. Like
and it just made so much sense too.
It did.
You bring a lot to the book that I don't. You bring a family perspective that I could never bring to the book, and that's so. I think that's so important to the book also.
Yeah, and I also think something that both Mike and I have been excited about, and we're recording this on election day, so maybe top of mind for me today, but is that Mike and I come from pretty different like backgrounds and perspectives, and it feels like increasingly we don't have those opportunities to collaborate with folks that aren't perfectly ideologically aligned with us. And so I think it's always been appealing to me about our collaboration and this project as a whole, where, on the show and in the book, we talk, the people I talked to for the book, it's so many different people from so many different kind of walks of life and really have different takes on things, but are so aligned on this issue. And I just think that that's something that also, that I think Mike and I were just also really both excited about from the beginning, of like, we can really demonstrate this collaboration, which is, an unexpected collaboration, right? I think like it's are you a boomer, Mike? I'm like, I don't want to call you out your name.
Last year, born in 64.
Very like
so
the young boomer.
Right on the edge of
obviously like, long-term law enforcement professional, from originally from a small town in Texas, and and then me, a liberal novelist from Seattle. It's like, it's an unexpected collaboration. And I think that that's such a strength of it, because it's been really such a good reminder to me, that we all get, and rightly so, but get passionate about our beliefs and our politics, but also just remembering that we can find a lot of strength in working with folks that we just might not have expected to find so much alignment with. So I think that was just a really interesting, we can make a really bold statement and kind of build a big tent with just the strength of that. And we've had so many different people on the show. I mean, I challenge you to find, another show that's recently featured a Republican sheriff and, and a trans abolitionist practically in back-to-back seasons. So, and these are all people that really respect each other. And so I think that's
I think that's why it's going to be a bestseller, because not only is it interesting, it's needed. If we don't get beyond the political head banging at each other and vitriol and anger and real, frankly, immaturity. There's a real immaturity there, especially when you put the topic of children being safe, when people can't transcend their own emotions, their own ideas to come together. I think it really highlights what's really wrong with the country right now in terms of political vitriol. I think that's a whole other reason why this book is going to be a bestseller and why it's needed, because we need our professionals in these systems to frankly get beyond themselves and get beyond their own attitudes, whatever those attitudes are, to be able to come together and work with people that are different. Yeah. And if you can't work with people who are different, you have a maturity problem. And if you have a maturity problem, you shouldn't be advocating for kids because you can't do it properly, is where I stand on it.
Yeah. I completely agree with all of that.
Yep.
And this isn't something, this is, like Andrea said, this is something that shouldn't be a political issue. Yep. Right? We're talking about protecting children. We're talking about the abuse of children. Both sides should be good with this. And when we get into the offender psychological profile of these offenders, they will use these type of things to divide people. Yes. Right. So they will use this, they're only picking on me because I'm a homeschooler, or they're only picking on me because, on the left, I live in this commune over here. And they'll use that as a way to gather support and gather people around them and kind of cloud the issue of what it really is. And it's just child abuse.
Yes. And the kids get lost in the cloudiness. Absolutely. This book was incredibly healing for me. I am so appreciative that y'all broached the topics of, I hate saying it like this, but regular old child abuse and Munchausen's. Growing up in a home where I was sexually abused, there are a lot of elements that are similar. And I'm a believer that I would write the DSM. I would write it very differently when it comes to personality disorder. I would write it very differently when it comes to child abuse, when it comes to things in the human condition that are more on a continuum to me than in a separate category. Like I had asthma. My mom would blow cigarette smoke in my face. It doesn't quite hit the level of Munchausen's, right? Of systematic abuse. I didn't get to a point of being in hospice as a child, but there were elements of my mother that she enjoyed making me ill. And then she enjoyed being the mother that took me to the doctor all the time. We were always medicated, always going to the doctor, because that proves she's a good mother. So I think there are so many shades of gray for people in mental health to understand what's going on, for people in medicine to understand what's going on. And it's hard to talk about because we've moved into a world where everything is evidence-based, scientifically studied. And the real truth about catching child abuse is it doesn't start with some kind of proof that's shoved right in your face. It starts with an intuitive gut feeling of something's off here. And we've done such a job dismissing that human perception, that intuition, as nonsense, as bull, as frou-frou, as woo-woo, as untestable, not real, particularly because manipulative types are full of it when they say that they have a feeling. But if we're not a manipulative type and we're trying to protect a child in our lives and we're having an uncomfortable feeling, that's a rich piece of information. And if we can't validate that, that's part of why I do a show called Emotional Badass. If we can't validate that we have to honor that aspect of humanity as a key element to being able to be the protectors of children and then drive these things through legal process, then I don't know how we ever get on top of it.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for sharing that piece with us, Nikki. And I'm so glad that the book resonated with you in that way. And we hear from a lot of people, that their stories don't necessarily fit squarely into like, a version of Munchausen by proxy abuse that would be criminally prosecutable,
Right.
or they sort of really, the psychological and emotional elements of it resonate with them, or those pieces too. And so there certainly is a spectrum. And I think, to your point about the gut feeling, it's funny because it when you look into these cases and how they play out in court, if you have a good enough defense attorney and enough money to spend on expert witnesses, there really isn't any evidence that is enough. That is what I have found. I mean, in my sister's case, you had all of the sort of gold standard evidence you could ever have. You had video evidence of of her doing something in the hospital. You had the medical, like a top expert reviewing the 73,000 pages of medical records, and still they got fixated on, in court, was it, this type of syringe that she was using or this other type of syringe? Because if it was the second type of syringe, then you didn't see what you thought you saw with her dumping this medication. I mean, just so preposterous, right? So it gets this like zeroed in forest for the trees, when in fact, like two things are really true here. I think number one, I think that the sort of gut feeling and the intuition should never be ignored. And I think when you talk to people, and when Mike does all of his collateral interviews with friends and family and teachers, that is often what they describe, right? They might not have that much familiarity with Munchausen by proxy abuse, that they know something's wrong. They know something's off. They have a very strong feeling that that child is in trouble. And then secondly, there is robust scholarship and knowledge with child abuse, with some child abuse professionals about this form of abuse, and certainly with, to sort of broaden the lens out to child abuse in general, which a lot of other forms of child abuse are really coming into question. There's this big quote debate. I say put that in scare quotes because it shouldn't be a debate, but it unfortunately is, about, abusive head trauma, which is a much more there's sort of much more robust science around that. But, you have child abuse pediatricians who are the most knowledgeable people to evaluate these things. And actually, huge I would not even say misconception, I would say piece of disinformation about child abuse pediatricians is like, oh, they're just trained to look for abuse. Well, actually, no, they're the most knowledgeable to find abuse, but also to rule out abuse. So they're the least likely to make assumptions based on things that you wouldn't want people to make assumptions on about parents, right? Race, class, how they present, what they're acting like in the, in the ICU, whatever it is, and then that's backed up by data. So there actually is this robust sort of scholarship and data around child abuse in general, less so around Munchausen by proxy because it hasn't been as well studied, but nonetheless, there is, there is that data there, and that doesn't necessarily sway people, right? It's like I think we all appreciate in the landscape that we're in that people are not always swayed by data and evidence. But then I also think like that gut feeling and that intuition piece, it is important. And we often say, or you often hear these cases described, even by medical professionals as like, oh, well, these Munchausen by proxy is so complicated to diagnose. And it sort of, it is and it isn't. I know Mike's laughing over here. I would say it's complicated on the level of like, it's work intensive. Like, and Mike can kind of speak to the investigation piece. It's a lot of work to get enough evidence to present it in court. In terms of like knowing whether or not it's happening, this is not a subtle form of abuse. Like, especially the cases that ever make it to court. I mean, you're just talking about, it's not one diagnosis. It's not one thing. It's everything everywhere all the time. And it really does tend to be where like that offender might have her little cult, and I say her because 96% female offenders might have her little cult of people, maybe her family members, maybe her spouse, maybe some folks from her church, or just some people that are really sort of bought in that will not say that anything's wrong. But by and large, almost everyone else who's been around that child, multiple doctors from different hospitals, teachers, social work, will have observed things that are very, very concerning. So yes, they're complicated cases to put together for court, but it's actually not that complicated to see. And once you've seen it, you kind of can't unsee it, which is why I get so many messages from people who listen to the show and say, I listened to the show and now I'm looking at my sister-in-law, my aunt, my this thing that happened in my family, this mom I know on social media. And, it's because it just, the pattern is so strong.
So Mike,
Yes, ma'am.
can you add to this? Can you talk us through, because you've had a long career starting out with child abuse crimes or child sex crimes? Was it specifically?
Well, crimes against children, it started, I became an investigator in crimes against children at Arlington PD before I retired. And that includes physical abuse, sexual abuse, all forms of child abuse.
Okay, so tell my audience how you've progressed from doing that work to this, and like what's going on in legal realms within the court system about this as an issue.
Well, first, I will tell anyone that suspects this abuse happening, if you suspect, just like with any other form of abuse, you report. Now, are the agencies tasked with handling this going to do their job? That's not your concern, especially medical professionals. That's not your concern. If you suspect, you report. And then the other agency should do the investigation. So we're really behind the 8 ball currently on education, both CPS and police. We're working on it. But as far as how I got into this, just very happenstancely, I retired from Arlington. I went to the DA's office and I worked one case, and then I became the Munchausen by proxy guy. And which tends to happen. There was a CPS investigator. She became the Munchausen by proxy CPS investigator. And we actually worked, I think, my first 6 criminal cases together. Well, maybe my first 5. I don't think she was on the Ybarra case. And I dissuade people from that because that CPS investigator left for another job, and you're also going to burn out your employees. I don't know. I guess I'm a glutton for punishment. I just keep doing it, not for much longer. But I will tell you, the legal profession is the least educated on this. By that, I mean attorneys and judges. And that's where we see a lot of failure in this system. Even if CPS is removed, if CPS does the proper thing and removes a child, family court judge can turn around and give that child back, right? CPS attorneys may not even fight them giving the child back because they don't understand it. Andrea said, people say this is hard. I'm going to tell you what I hear when people say this is hard. What I hear them saying is, I don't want to do the work, or this is too expensive to prosecute, or we don't have the money for experts. I hear excuses. That's what I hear. Well, it is hard, but
what I see is the psychology at play that people are not even aware of. So I'm no contact from my mother and have been for about 20 years now. And I know from doing that psychologically, it is one of the most uncomfortable things that anybody can process. When I've had to say over the years, especially as a much younger woman, no, I'm not in relationship with my mother. You can see that it is such a conflict internally. If somebody had a decent mother, a good relationship with their mother, or their mother was just inadequate and they forgive their mother for her inadequacies, it is as if the idea of this is an unhealthy mother who isn't properly loving or caretaking her children confronts all of the mothering in all of the human condition. And most people are not aware. Talk about a bias. We talk about bias when it comes to race. We talk about bias when it comes to so many things. The bias of I have to look at a mother and think of her as criminal or evil or destructive or everything that a mother is not supposed to be is such a psychological wall that most people cannot and will not allow themselves that awareness. So I think it's a real human psychological problem. And just for the audience, Munchausen's means if I have Munchausen's, I make myself sick to get sympathy, maybe to start a GoFundMe, to get money for me, to basically make my identity. I'm the sick person and I'm a victim. We've all seen over the last 5-10 years how much being the victim has been pumped up by politics. So being the victim plus social media is now one of the best things you can be. I mean, that gets you the most attention in the world. That's why Munchausen's by proxy is I'm not making myself sick. I'm making a child or an elderly person, someone that I'm tasked to care for, sick. I expect these Munchausen's and Munchausen's by proxy to be growing right now so exponentially, it's a terrifying consideration.
Yeah.
I say all the time with the, with the explosion of social media, you have the attention fix at your fingertips,
Yep.
and then you have the ability with the internet to Google symptoms at your fingertips to present to doctors. It's the easiest crime to commit and get away with.
Yep.
It's certainly in my state, and I believe the easiest child abuse crime to commit and get away with in the U.S. for sure.
Yep.
Yeah.
And when I have reported over the course of my career on suspected Munchausen's by proxy. And I recognize the dilemma for the people working in those systems, because they have to choose, is it the kid that's getting cigarettes put out on him, which is an easy thing to look at, or is it this kid that's getting too much healthcare? I mean, it's such an easy thing to dismiss when you're overloaded on top
especially
of
if you have a bias against the healthcare industry.
Yes.
Right. I mean, with
Yeah.
COVID, we've seen, no matter which side you fall on,
Yep.
There's a lot of this country who
Yep.
they lost a lot of trust in the medical profession
Mhm.
with this. And I say all the time in trainings, we are challenging the social construct of motherhood on these cases. And it
Yes.
is one of the hardest things to get over with our attorneys, to make them understand it. And then, they're looking at risk reward in trying these cases.
Mhm.
And, if they think they can't win, are they going to try a case? Are they going to do the right thing? Or are they going to do the easy thing?
Yeah.
Well, and people don't know that, who haven't been a part of the system in any way. I have been saying lately that, what we want in our hearts and in our minds is we want our legal system to do what's healthy, what's right. We actually have a legal system of finding loopholes, and that's as far from healthy as it could possibly be. And when we look at an issue like Munchausen's by proxy, my God, the children that fall through the cracks of that. People also don't realize how much I think statistics play in. I was highly offended going through as a victim, realizing that the detectives were off and the DA's offices were also often excited. I was a statistic. They got to nab a bad guy. And me being able to feel that and feel the immaturity and the people that were tasked with taking care of me through that process, I was hot mad going through that process. I felt incredibly disrespected and re-traumatized because I was just a number. And so I think there's a lot that makes this very, very difficult for all involved.
Yeah. Well, I'm so sorry that you had that experience, Nikki. And I think like I having gotten so deep in this the past couple of years, I kind of feel both ways. You definitely see that, and then I think on our side of things, you often see a couple of cases I'm thinking of top, including my sister's, but the one I'm, deep in for the next season of our show, you also see these cases where the CPS investigators do everything right and
Yes,
the detectives
absolutely.
do everything right.
Yep.
And they just, really, really put their heart into these cases and clearly take it seriously and clearly understand the danger this child is in, for them to only for them to sort of hand it off to the prosecutor or DA's office and just have it just dropped, and that person gets their children back and then gets to go and say that they were, quote, exonerated, which of course that's not what exonerated means, but and say, oh, I was cleared and all these people are in a conspiracy against me. And I think, like, just to kind of circle back around to the politics of it all and sort of the cultural moment that we're in. And, we use this framing in the book. And I think, again, this is where Mike and I kind of coming from these different perspectives is really helpful, because, both sides get it wrong for their own reasons and get it wrong consistently. Right. And so I've thought a lot about sort of why people react to these cases the way that they do, and the resistance that they have. And, this even comes, for me when I'm reaching out to sources and stuff, like sometimes, we have a lot of listeners and I have great fans, and also people that have very, very strong negative feelings about me. And I think some of that really goes into this sort of conspiracy theory mindset that has really taken hold with this. And that, interestingly, is really shared by both sides, right? Like, I think, even though we think of the parents' rights movement, the extremes of it, right, where you're thinking about kind of the like don't say gay bills or book bans or like that kind of thing, where there's this really strong resistance to the idea of really like kind of any state institutions having a say in families, right? I think that's what like at its core that's kind of about. And where that plays out in child abuse and in medical child abuse, Munchausen by proxy specifically, is this medical kidnapping narrative that really came up in the Kowalski case, and to a high degree. And then, there's a lot of these other cases, including my sister's, that have been included in that reporting. But this is basically the conspiracy theory that medical professionals are separating children from their families, which is of course not done by medical professionals, it's done by the courts, but blamed on the doctors handily. And, this idea that like innocent parents are bringing their kids to the doctor, and because of, misdiagnosis or bad will or egos on the doctors, or, sometimes they try and do this real backflip into financial incentives, which is hilarious because child abuse doctors are some of the like least well-paid doctors in this. Like, if you want to go into a subspecialty to make medicine, like, do not choose child abuse. You will make no money. You'll probably do a lot of work that is not compensated, in fact. And some of the hardest work you could ever sign up for. But nonetheless, you have this sort of constellation of motivations. And I am very comfortable saying this is a full-on conspiracy theory. There is no evidence that this has happened. When these cases are presented in the media, it is a string of anecdotes with very deliberate obfuscation about who said what. And when you dig into these cases and read the police reports and read like, oh, they're saying doctors disagreed, but they're talking about treating physicians versus doctors that were hired as expert witnesses by the defense, right? Not exactly a one for one. And it's interesting again, because although you would think of this as something that sort of fits maybe squarely into some of the far right conversation, it has been, some of the worst offenders in spreading in the media are people that consider themselves very liberal. People like Mike Hixenbach from NBC, Deanne Neary from New York Magazine that did the big piece that went mega viral about the Kowalski case. Caitlin Keating, who was the architect of Take Care of Maya. It's very interesting to see people who really identify with, the left side of the spectrum and consider themselves liberally and outwardly are liberal. And these are people that like live in New York City, et cetera. Not Mike Hixenbach, but and very like the rest of their work is very sort of like squarely on the progressive side. And I'm like, wow, you are doing like some of the dirtiest dirty work in terms of like conspiracy theory, parents' rights stuff. And I think there's something that really, I just think that sort of gets to that fear that you were talking about, right? And of going up against the institution of motherhood itself. And that just makes people so uncomfortable. And I was talking to, a colleague who's a child abuse pediatrician the other day about this, and they, I was thinking like, why does this, like, I understand the fear, right? I'm a parent. I have a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old. The idea of someone taking your children away under any circumstances is so terrifying. That is a visceral fear that people respond to. And I don't blame people for responding, emotionally to manipulative media stories, right? That's how they're designed. You see crying parents, you only hear about from the parents, obviously the kids are not on camera talking. You don't even hear what happened to the kids most of the time, which is where, your sympathies really should be. But nonetheless, I think why it registers for people. And I think we went through a similar cultural thing, and, Mike watched this happen within his profession, right? Like a similar sort of cultural reckoning about child sex abuse is like, if you have to accept that someone who seems normal and loving is capable of the most monstrous things you could possibly imagine. And I think there's so much about this abuse that is particularly disturbing to people because it's not something that happens in a moment of rage. It's not something that happens because of substance abuse, these other things that are just a little bit more
calculated.
Yeah, it's so calculated. It's long term. It's really, someone doing something to their own child like that is just so horrific. It's so planned. It's so deliberate and
ongoing.
It's
very different than I got angry and I hit somebody.
Right. I had a bad moment. Yes, which I think like most parents, like if we're honest with ourselves, you would never do that. You take a breath, you have hopefully good coping mechanisms, but we understand how people get there, especially if, again, there's sort of these other factors. But I think this form of abuse, it's like, if you have to accept that, and that's why we called the book The Mother Next Door, it's like, if you have to accept that someone, in your family, someone that seems like you, that seems normal, that nice mom that you chat with on pickup, that mom that's, not even the nice mom, the mom who seems the most heroic, the most, loving, the one that would go to the ends of the earth for their child's, medical care, if we have to accept that person could be capable of this and that they don't outwardly seem like a monster, people like to talk about sort of offenders like, oh, they're monsters. And I think that's so unhelpful, because the reality is, like, they're not this inhuman other thing. They're just human beings who are capable of these kind of things. And that's a scary world to live in, right? And I think as parents, we want to be able to identify the people who are scary for our children, and we want to think that we can do that easily. And so if you can, it's actually more comforting to think, and I think we all, like, as Americans, and I think especially right now across the board, on both sides, have lost a lot of faith in our institutions, and sort of the idea of this huge bureaucratic, uncaring sort of system, however you think of it, whether you think of that as the state or if you think about it as the hospital system. And a lot of people have had bad experiences with the hospital system. It's like, I think it fits somewhere for people, and it's actually much less scary than just thinking, oh, this could be a mom that you know.
Well, and the big system picking on mom sells a lot more papers, sells a lot more. You get a lot more clicks on that than mom abused her child, no matter how great the details are of that abuse. And a lot of times you don't have that in these cases because you don't have anything public. Doctors can't talk about it, CPS can't talk about it, and the family court record's sealed. So the only side out there is what the offender is telling the media. And
however, Mike, that I think that is true, and I think it's sort of a like low hanging fruit in a way to just be like, oh, you have this, ready story. But I would challenge my colleagues in the media truly to think about what would what is more compelling. I mean, what's responsible, right? I mean, number one, I'm working on a paper right now on this. Like, how should the media be covering these cases? And I mean, I think number one, if you have an offender in any child abuse case who's coming to you with their story about how they were, how their child was medically kidnapped and how they, were treated unfairly by the system, et cetera. If that person is not willing to be fully transparent and show you all the family court documents and sign a HIPAA waiver so the doctors can talk to you, do not cover that story. If a person is not willing to be fully transparent, you are going to end up with a harmful, asymmetrical story where the only narrative that's getting any space is that parent's narrative. And there is a very, very high chance that you are platforming a parent who's an abusive parent as an innocent party. And that's very dangerous. So that's what I would say. But also, like, I think there is this idea that, like, oh, this plays and people are interested. But I would hold up the show as a proof of concept that actually people are quite interested in the truth about these cases. And so, like, if those people, I would like to see more of my colleagues in the media be willing to, like, for heaven's sakes, guys, like, you can do a FOIA request. There is information you can find about these cases, especially when there's been a police investigation. So part of it is, and I don't want to be too hard on media folks because it's a difficult landscape and so much media, local media especially, has been eviscerated. But, like, there are stories to unearth, obviously, right? Here we are.
So the word that we haven't used yet is a word that I'm very passionate about. Manipulation. I have said for many, many years, unless and until this country, in all of the ways I could possibly mean this, starts dealing with manipulation, master manipulation in institutions, between people, if we don't start dealing with that head on and making that the conversation, we're talking around it constantly. The truth is, every mother who abuses this way is an absolute master manipulator and a sociopath. It's just that we're taking the sociopathic behavior through mental health and naming it all these different things. But when you boil it all away, all it is master manipulation. And I get my power from manipulating others and making them think falsehoods. And so when I look at media, I think we're asking one manipulative outlet to report on the manipulations of other abusers. No wonder this is a shit show. No wonder this is a mess.
That's a good point.
Because we're not dealing with manipulation in all the ways. We talk around it constantly. But to me, this book is about master manipulation. And you can see that what I loved in the end of the book is you highlighting, because I was thinking the thoughts and I was like, yay, she's writing it. She's writing it. because we have so much like a cheapened male perpetrator acceptance. If a male is upset with me, they're going to be aggressive. Okay, we have ripped that apart in society. We have looked at that every which way it could possibly be looked at this point. Yes, we know what is toxic about a dysfunctional male. Easy to spot, almost cheap to spot. We're not talking about that when it comes to women. There's a reason I have still struggled to put out an episode on what I love about women. I know you're a girl's gal. I'm a guy's gal. I have put out episodes on what I love about men. It is harder with women because we don't get aggressive when we're dysfunctional. Not typically. There's more aggression and femininity now because of equality. That's part of the downside of what we've pushed for. That equality means females will get more aggressive now. Yay, what did we win doing that? I don't know, but that's where we are. But if we don't start dealing with this really, truly, and deeply, we have to be able to spot this amongst women. Women are passive aggressive. Yeah. They will hurt you and stab you while they're smiling. They will look like the ethereal mother while they're poisoning their child. We have to start naming that, I think, like on its face. Between women, we have to start when we feel a manipulative vibe with another woman going, you trying to manipulate me? Was that honest? Because you told me I looked nice, but man, your energy said I look like shit. I caught that, We need to start calling that out in the female condition. We have to raise daughters that are not allowed to get away with that because women feel their power through verbal. And so if there's dysfunction, that's going to come out of a woman in a dysfunctionally verbal way. And that means she can master manipulate everybody around her.
Yeah. Well, these are such good points, Nikki. And yeah, I mean, we do, I know we do, we've talked about this before. We do diverge a bit in our opinions or our I would say not our opinions, our perspectives on it. And I think like, I think you're right. And I think this is something I've thought about a lot because of the sort of female offender question and the female offender versus male offender. And, I am a diehard feminist. My feminism is women are human beings and can be just as evil as male human beings. It just looks different. And our wonderful colleague, B. Yorker, who's studied this, for decades, she is a retired psychiatric nurse and also a professor emerita of criminal justice. So she's really got a great perspective on all of this. And she always points out that we're just much worse at recognizing female violence because it looks different. And you're right. It's this sort of like, I think it is much more on the surface with men and we understand what it looks like. And I think with women, it's much more subversive because it has had to be, right? I mean, women, as you mentioned, are much more punished for being outwardly aggressive or even assertive, right? I mean, you can't sort of get away with it. So it's sort of, I think that's why it ends up in this sort of like passive aggressive thing. And anyone who's ever been a teenage girl like knows that is just like a part of it, right?
And the power of that.
And it's it's wounding, right? Yeah, it is. It's very true. I think, and I have had like, I am a girl's girl. I love women, but I've also had like most of my worst experiences in my life with women. So it's both. And I think it's just important to look at, men and women are different. We are socialized very differently.
Yes.
Whether you want to say one thing is sort of endemic or,
our brains are different. Our brains, our energy is different.
Yeah. I agree with you there. And I also think that, from what we know about this, and I would love to hear also, Mike's perspective on this, but I mean, I really think like the fact that you have a high percentage of female offenders in this abuse, I don't think it has anything to do with specifically the female brain. I think it has to do, it so plugs into our cultural archetypes of what we celebrate women for, which is that, and it's interesting talking to like, I had another of our committee colleagues, Dr. Kathy Ayub on the show, and she's a psychologist, and she was talking about when men lie, right, when you get a man who's a con artist and sort of doing one of these big fabulous journeys, right, where they tend to lie about like, oh, I was a Navy SEAL and like I'm in the CIA and like these very sort of like the things that men are celebrated for, right, like the things that men will get admiration for, and they fit in neatly into these, or they lie about being a super rich guy, it's like the things that men get attention for. So when women lie for their own, again, intrinsic purposes, to get sympathy, to get attention, to be seen a certain way, they're going to lie about the stuff that women get attention for, which is being a good caretaker, being a sort of heroic martyr figure. You know, that mother, martyr, savior figure is like one of the strongest archetypes across cultures that we have in the humanity, really. And so, you know, it makes sense. Like when you see it that way, it's like, yeah, they're lying about the things that will get them that attention. Because if a woman were to like lie about military service and being rich, there's actually quite a lot of blowback for women that are good at those things. So you wouldn't get the same bang for your buck, you know. But if you're lying in a way that like, and they sort of, it is also sort of positioning themselves as the least threatening thing, right? It's like,
Yes.
we're not conditioned to see mothers as threatening, even though I wholeheartedly believe mothers can be as threatening as fathers. Just again, it looks different. And they sort of, they really position themselves as this most heroic, sympathetic figure. So I do think that like our cultural archetypes, and they shift as the culture shifts, but I think it's really, you know, I think that to me, that I think that's what it's about.
Well, and when you're asking people to face this, you're really asking them to grieve.
Yeah.
Grief is one of my specialties, and grief is one of the things that we will subconsciously push away and not even realize that that's what we're pushing away. Because to admit this, that this is a major problem amongst our feminine side of humanity, means that we grieve that ideal archetype. I'm a believer that all of us have the inner child in us that wants ideals. And it wants every mother to be good. Of course it does. And so if I admit, this mother is not good, then I grieve that whole psychological ideal. And I think that's a big player in why you find that people don't want to look at this. They will put up a blinder and not, it can't be that bad. No mother would do that. They just can't see it, because to see it and accept it means you grieve and you let go of that ideal. And there's not one human on this planet that would tell me they're willing and able and just ready to let go of that ideal.
Yeah, and we want to be able to trust women. I think that's it's important both for men and women, right? I think like
Yes.
men want to be able to trust like their, you know, I think we all have I think whether you had a good one or a bad one. Fortunately for me, I had a wonderful one that I have like a good relationship with on into adulthood. But I think whether you had a good mother or a bad mother, like people want to believe, like you said, in that idea. And I think for women, you know, it's interesting where this like plays on these opposite sides of the political spectrum, right? I think you know, on the right, I think you have this like very strong ideal of motherhood and of that sort of being a sort of
Put on a
sacred,
pedestal.
yeah, put on a pedestal and a sacred place for women. And like, you know, obviously that can have some toxic outgrowths, but there's a lot that sort of like, you know, really sort of beatifies motherhood. And then on the left, you have this idea of like being able to trust women and believing in women and sort of, you know, that concept, which again, I don't think there's anything bad about sort of either of those things on their face, but I think that this provides a cover for these offenders on either side, and that is what they look for, right? Like they look for something that's going to provide a cover, and it can sort of look like anything, and it can look like getting this group invested or getting this other group invested, or sort of, you know, whether it's the anti-vaxxers or the Innocence Project or whomever, it's like they will, or a church. You see a lot of churches in these, I think, because they do provide that structure and that cover, and so it's really it's such a it's a very opportunistic thing. And I think that is like, again, manipulators and abusers. I mean, I think all abusers are manipulators to a huge degree, maybe not quite in the sort of pathological way that these abusers are, but you know, they're gonna be opportunistic, right? They're gonna look for, and I'm very much a believer in terms of on the gender lines, that people will take power where they can access power. And one of the only places we give women unchecked power in our society is over the health and well-being of children. And so it makes sense that that's where you find your female offenders. And if we lived in a different society, it might look different.
Well, and men are conditioned to take a back seat, to really give that reverie to females. So to manage this Munchausen's issue, it also sounds to me like a call to action to fathers and men to go, hey, if you're having that intuitive, something is off feeling, to not just take a back seat and be able to step in for children, go, wait a minute, something smells funny here for me. Like something is off. I'm concerned about this, and not just sort of give that up because the females know better about the small children, like to be able to really trust your male instincts to protect too.
Well, and as far as the manipulation aspect, just in these cases,
Mhm.
I mean, it goes far outside many of them, especially your advanced offenders. It goes far outside just the health of their child, right? I've had them claim to be nurses, to be PhDs. They almost get a sense out of lying about being more than they are, and in that respect. And as far as the fathers go, yeah, I've told Andrea many times, I don't know if these offenders make them that way or if they marry them that way, but most of our dads are really passive. Not all.
Both. It's both. It's chicken and the egg. They
Right.
look for passive ones, and then they just keep becoming more and more passive as they take more and more power, as the woman takes more and more power.
Yeah. And the dads that have stood up, that
Mhm.
have tried to do the right thing pretty consistently are
Mhm.
treated pretty terribly by family court system and just get knocked down. And at some point they give up. I've seen it in dads, and you know, I understand it. What are you going to do? You're going to fight the system. You're going to fight the power. How are you going to do this? Other than kidnapping your child and taking them out of the country, which I do not advise any father to do. Let me be clear.
Mhm.
But you know, I mean, there's no other source. So I think psychologically they just go. I won't say denial, but they go into, you know, protective mode and just say, look, I've got to distance myself because this is going to kill me if I don't.
Yeah, I think those are some of the real struggles with around us. Yep.
Yeah, and the assault on anybody who is, you know, particularly on the child victims, of course, but really anybody else in the orbit of one of these offenders, whether it's a family member that stands by them, whether it's a spouse,
Mhm.
you know, the father of the children, like it's really hard to overstate how destructive this abuse is to everyone
Mhm.
involved, because it just decimates families financially because of, you know, medical bills, or, you know, it's
Mhm.
just for things they don't need, or, you know, court costs, or I mean that kind of thing. I mean, it just bankrupts families. And just the psychological abuse is really to everyone in their lives, right? Because I think sometimes when people are looking at, you know, the Munchausen behavior, which Nikki did a great job putting that in plain language of that, you know, that's someone who does these behaviors to themselves. And even the people that get caught up in that, you know, in a fake cancer thing or something. I mean, the level of betrayal when someone has pulled you into one of these things is so severe. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that I have, I have real compassion for the dads in these
Oh,
cases.
yeah.
You know, because they have been experiencing that assault as well. And especially
Mhm.
if they are, you know, we've had some dads that it's a pretty common dynamic where they, again, and I do think it's partly it's their reaction to the assault of living with this person, and part of it is that they choose people that will be good for this role. And so you see, you know, people that are in the military or dads that travel a lot, right? Again, with just the
Mhm.
Right.
opportunism of it.
Yep.
And I think actually that, you know, one of our dads who came to, we talked to on the first season of the show, George Honeycutt, who is a fantastic advocate for, you know, for victims and survivors, and is just a great guy. But he really came to his senses quicker than I think anybody, Mike and I, have ever seen. Just really recognized what was happening sort of straight away. And I think part of it is because he was gone. He was on tours of duty in Afghanistan, and he wasn't
Mhm.
sort of subject to that gaslighting. And people use
Mhm.
gaslighting's become a really funny term because people use it in this very like sort of colloquial way now, and everything's
Yes.
gaslighting. It's like,
Just like they
okay,
do
like,
PTSD. Yes.
yeah,
Yes. It's
exactly.
all
It's like,
watered
okay,
down.
someone
Yeah.
disagreeing with you is not gaslighting. But
Yes.
you know, that really like gaslighting in this case, which is like which is someone systematically making you doubt your perception of reality. And it is really damaging and takes a very long time to
It's
recover from, as
literal
I can
crazy
attest to.
making.
Yeah,
It is
it's crazy
convincing you
making.
that it's really night outside while you
Right.
see the sun, and you question everything to where you don't really know what's real, and you can't trust yourself anymore. And
Yeah.
when you can't trust yourself anymore, you dismiss your own intuitive vibe before anybody else even dismisses it.
Yes. Yeah. And it's
That's the
so
point of
disorienting.
gaslighting,
That's the
y'all.
point of it. It's the point is to
Yes.
get you, is to destabilize you and sort of make you vulnerable to the belief system that they're trying to sell you. And so I think that part of the reason George was able to really, you know, come in with that clarity, and part of it's just because of the person he is, but was because he was not as subject to that daily stuff. And I think even like Ryan Crawford, who's another dad that we're seeing too, because he wasn't in a relationship with the offender, really was sort of able to see it. But I think for the dads that are like living in the home that are subject to this, and you see so many things, and I can attest to this personally. It's like you do see evidence, right? It's like they're going to the doctor and they're saying, well, this is what the doctor said, and well, the doctor did the procedure, and like it's you really have to understand that, okay, like if that person's lying to the doctor, then that's not on the doctor. The doctor's not necessarily co-signing it. But it can get very confusing, and then my God, you get an attorney in there, and the attorney's making the case, and it's like I understand why people get confused and lose sight of the truth, especially if they've really been worn down by that offender. And nonetheless, I think, like, again, to sort of take what I see as really the feminist stance here, is that I don't think dads care less about their children than moms, and they're not less capable of being parents. And I think like that is a way that until, right now, this moment in history, I talk about a lot of friends that are my age. I'm 42, and a lot of like the concept of what it means to be a dad has changed so much over the last generation. And so I think like I'm hopeful that this is something that could get better as we really see, more equal breakdowns in parenting, right? And like just dads being more used to, being also a person that takes the kid to the doctor. And, and that's not to say that like, however people want to figure out their, their parenting structure in the home is right or wrong. But I think that is like, I just think we shouldn't shortchange dads. And I really, the bravery that we've seen from some of the dads who've stood up for their kids and really put everything on the line, lost so much money, so much damage to their reputation. I mean, just the like how nasty these things get in court, and seeing
probably
dads,
years of their life.
Inevitably years. Inevitably years. I mean, you take on one of these perpetrators, like you can see why people are disincentivized to do it.
And Andrea, you brought up George Honeycutt, and he helped me recently on a case by talking to a dad and got that dad fully on board. And Nikki, kind of to bring it back, something you mentioned earlier about, kind of feeling used by the system. That dad, Andrea's going to have an episode coming up on her show about this dad, Derek Jones. He was pretty badly treated, I will put, by our DA's office, both the CPS attorneys for our DA's office and the criminal prosecutors for our DA's office. And basically had to fight to get his case criminally heard. And we ended up, because be very clear, because of mistakes made by the DA's office, they left this lady out on bond after she had pled guilty. And she poisoned her child with Benadryl, and to the point of making the child shake. And we're talking, she admitted to giving the child 4 to 6 Benadryl at a time to a 4-year-old in order to cause her to shake, to simulate symptoms of a seizure disorder. Did it in the hospital, by the way. Confessed to it. Benadryl was in her purse. Benadryl was in the child's blood. So, I mean, this was not a hard case at all.
Straightforward, yeah.
Very straightforward. And he was just treated terribly by the system. And if he hadn't, I told him, go to every court hearing, be in their face, stay on it. And that's what he had to do. And in my county, our DA's office, the CPS attorneys are also our DA's attorneys. They never even called me on the case. So they gave him managing conservatorship of the children. But now, even after she's convicted and given 60 years in prison because of her continued behavior, she would get out on bond. And then find a new boyfriend, poison his kids. I arrested her for bond violation. The DA's office didn't ask for a bond forfeiture hearing to hold her in custody. She got out again. She got another boyfriend, poisoned his kids. After the second time I put her in jail, finally, she's kept there. She was an attractive 33-year-old female. And that has power to it in these,
it does.
In these circumstances. But he's going to now have to go. Derek's going to have to go and pay for attorneys to terminate her parental rights, when that should have been done. That should have been done by the CPS attorneys. And that is a failure continually in our system, and continually in my county, which has the most cases of this abuse. And it's a constant struggle that I have fought for 15 years.
It's
Yeah.
as if society will not accept the reality that sometimes the children should not be with the mother. It's just like we can't. I mean, I have a friend here in Colorado, same thing, like taking the kids to hotel rooms where there's gang members where and you're wondering if the kids got molested, and this mother just continues to get custody and visitation and with no safety for the kids, and nobody's seeming to step in with just a reasonable eye to say that this is not good. You have to do some things to be able to visit these children, because you have to be stable, you have to be secure, and once we have certain proofs, that mother should never be allowed to be alone with those children ever again.
Yeah, I really agree with you, and I think that this case that that Mike is talking about is a really like very clear cut example of this, especially
Yeah.
because this woman, while she was out in bond, just like was such a clear serial offender, was just like went and was like, all right, well, I don't have access to my own kids, I'll go find a new boyfriend and his kids, a new boyfriend and his kids, and was just so clearly dangerous. And we just really don't see mothers that way. And I think we have, and there's
Wait, Andrea, not just mothers. It's that we don't see, this is, again, I would write this differently in the DSM. Addiction is one of my specialties. We are not dealing with how addiction actually shows up in the human condition. We like to put the addiction on heroin or on alcohol or on something like gambling. We don't like putting it on child abusers, but find a child abuser that doesn't have an addictive quality. You can't do it. You can't. My abuser had abused his own kids, was through the court system for it before he was allowed to adopt me. We're not even looking at this addictive quality, because this type of abuse, think about how it hits the nervous system. The moment that mother is giving that medication to that child, is shooting something up into the IV, you get a high from that moment. And that is why they will not stop. That is why that woman went on to abuse somebody else's kids. And that will continue until and unless they are actually stopped. And this addictive quality is considered by the legal system as because across the board, these abusers reoffend. It's not like 20% of them do, 40%. It is across the board. I'd make the argument it's 100%, but we don't deal with that in any way.
That's a really astute observation. And and you're quite right. I mean, this abuse in particular, and I think like there, I just with the caveat that there are some abuse situations, and I think we were talking about those situations where it's substance abuse or some other like really, and there's sort of like or if someone or if, for instance, if a mother is over medicalizing their child because they're suffering from postpartum psychosis, right? Like that's a condition where it can be treated, and then not easy to get a hold of, but certainly much easier than this behavior. I think when you're talking about something that's such a compulsive behavior, and that's why I think when Mike does an investigation, it's so thorough, because you're showing like how this pattern is so pervasive, it's so ongoing, and it escalates. And you do see that pattern where they have to do more and more extreme things to sort of get that same high, that same feedback. And you can just really, really see it when you look at the overall pattern of the case. And I think that it is, from my perspective, and I'm not, I don't necessarily on the whole feel like wild about throwing people in prison. I have some like feelings about the complications of that. However, I think in the current system we have, that seems to be the best remedy for people that are not safe to be around people and like be in members of their community. And I think especially like, I think in these cases, I always feel tremendous relief if an offender, in the very, very rare instances that offenders are held accountable, mostly because Mike's there, when they are put in prison until their children come of age. Like that is a huge relief, right? Because I think that we need to face and accept as a society that some people are not able to provide a safe home for children. And I think that's something I appreciate about child abuse pediatricians. When they make their recommendations for the court, they're not diagnosing someone with a psychological disorder. They're not offering thoughts on whether that person should be put in jail or not. They are evaluating, can this person provide a safe home for a child, yes or no? And that's the important question. And I just all of my work really stems from the belief that children deserve to be safe in their homes. And like that is something where I think when certain behavior crosses a line, if you beat a kid up so bad that they're in the hospital, if you sexually abuse a child, then what happens to that person on a punitive level is not something I'm so concerned about. I'm concerned that children are kept safe from them going forward because you have proven yourself to not be a safe person for children. And I think this behavior falls really cleanly into that metric, right? If you do this, and it's not that I don't have compassion for offenders. I think I have more compassion for offenders than most people because I had one in my family. And it's not that I don't think those people deserve help or compassion. They're still human beings, but they're not safe to be around children. And that just seems very obvious to me.
I have a thing about, I think society has really messed up the idea and the concept of second chances. And some kind of way, nice people, kind people think I'm supposed to give infinity chances again and again and again. And some kind of way, like I say a lot, that dysfunction flip-flops things. There seems to be more of a desire to give the mother second chances and third chances and fifth chances than to give the children a chance at getting some years of safety and security and stability. And that to me is such a dysfunctional flip-flop of why would we give the abuser so many chances when the implication for the children
CPS is
for the whole rest of their lives.
CPS's mandate in every state that I know of, their mandate is family reunification.
Oh yeah, that
is their mandate, and there are some things that should never be allowed in, and that is, I feel that the family unification, because they're not going to monitor, they're not going to do what the guideline says. There's not going to be lifetime monitoring of this person. There's not going to be long-term monitoring of this person. I don't think family unification or reunification with the offender should ever happen in these cases.
No. So this is where I say a family is like a cult. You can leave a cult. And if you leave a cult, everybody outside of the cult goes, good for you. I'm glad you left that cult. But a family has a stronger cult-like mentality. And when you leave a dysfunctional family, nobody really goes, yay, good for you. They go, really? But that was your mother. You only have one family.
Yeah.
But we also know that the most abuse happens within a family system. So again, a very interesting flip-flop of, wow, we just put these things up on a pedestal. And even in the face of a child getting hurt or murdered, we still let it sit up high on the pedestal.
Well, Nikki, and you said that at the top, that you've had that experience with people saying that to you about your mother. And I've had that experience with people saying that to me about my sister. I think that's one of those things that it's like, you sort of know a fellow traveler when you see one, because if someone just goes, oh yeah, like that sounds like that was the right choice for you, then probably that's something they've come against in their own life, or they're in like a profession like, Mike or I is in, where they're facing this all the time. And it's like, I don't have any questions about people that don't speak to their parents. I sort of assume that's for a good reason, like no follow-up, no notes, no follow-up questions. But I think it really it upsets people. And it's certainly before I was talking about the details publicly, which was a long period, right? I did not turn right around and start believe it or not, this podcast was not just like a play for, I wasn't immediately like, wow, I'm, this thing happened to me and what an opportunity, which is just a sort of how, people are sometimes questionable about my motives as it's become my job. But there was a long period of my life, almost a decade, where I didn't talk at all about it publicly. And I didn't even really tell that many people in my life, the details of what happened. And when I would, especially if I ran into someone that knew me, in the before times when my sister was still a part of my life, or especially someone that knew my sister. Now, if they knew my sister well enough to know, well enough to have been exposed to their behavior, I think that was different. But for people that were just like, oh, you don't talk to your sister anymore, and they'd be very upset, and they just say things like, well, family's so important, and I hope you can reconcile with her someday. And I do think it upsets people to sort of have that, the idea of a broken family. And those of us that have had to go through it or are sort of more close up to some of these situations just understand that there's many situations where that would be the best choice, that are not, not as maybe extreme as your or my situation.
The sad dilemma for me with people is that I know that people who have conquered some kind of master manipulation in their own life are the ones that can see it. And so when people very innocently are like, oh no, like family is great, it's your sister. And what I realize and what is really, I think, heavy on my heart is, oh, this person hasn't had to conquer a master manipulator. So therefore they don't know that they exist everywhere.
Yeah.
How lovely for them.
Yeah. I mean,
Like,
I
that's
think
kind of what we want. Like, I don't want everybody to have
you
to
don't want to burst their
understand
bubble.
master
I know,
manipulation.
it's so true. It's so true. I mean, and I have a unique situation in terms of it being a sibling rather than a parent, because I do, certainly these behaviors with my sister, and I interviewed my parents for my upcoming season, which I did not think they would ever want to sit for an interview, and it was a very, very special to be able to sort of talk to them about all of this. And like, they certainly, talking to them, they see evidence of these behaviors that just go all the way back to when she was a kid. But I did not really become aware of it until we were teenagers and then in our 20s. And so, like, I really have a whole period of my life that I remember where, before this things got bad, and especially before things came to a head, I was at, I was 28 when I became estranged from my sister. So we really had a long time together and had a very, happy, loving family, nice, very sort of privileged upper middle class childhood, just like, where I was pretty oblivious to like how bad life could be. And so I actually do remember sort of being that person. I kind of don't recognize her now. I kind of can't put myself back in that mindset. But so I do sort of see it is a little bit like that matrixy situation of like, oh, like you haven't, I can't even remember which one is it that shows you the truth, the red pill. Like, it's like you sort of didn't, like, it's sort of like, oh, you sort of see this whole thing. And I think that's really increased for me, I'm sure, with you with your work, right? It's like you start with your story and then you see kind of like, I do feel like with my work and with people that do Mike's job and child abuse pediatricians, certainly it's like everyone else is just kind of like, not everyone else, but like a lot of other people are just kind of going about their day, like not understanding the world we live in. And then there's these people that sort of take on a role where you're like, all right, like I'm gonna sort of peel back the curtain here and just like stare into the darkness. And it's a really different perspective. And I do sometimes, yeah, it's like you like, sometimes people will be like, oh, I really want to listen to your show, but I just had a new baby, or my mom just died or something. And I'm like, yeah, don't, like, probably like, don't, you don't need to, like, this is not the time to sort of stare into the abyss,
The biggest stressor for me, I can deal with pretty much anything. I can separate really well, but the biggest stressor with this abuse has come with having to deal with people who should be protecting the children and who aren't. We talk in the book about, Nikki, you'll find this interesting since you brought it up earlier. We talk in the book about a prosecutor that confronted me and told me that my comparisons between this and pedophilia were off base, very off base. And she was offended by it and said I was trying to scare prosecutors. And, that's what we have to I have had to deal with. And those are the things that really cause me the most stress. The job itself, the job, I've always liked the job. I focus on the positives and what I'm doing, the positive outcome in the case. And I try to focus on those cases. Don't always succeed, but the biggest stressors come is not from a not guilty. I can handle that all day long. I will respect a jury verdict all day long. It's from never even getting it there because people refuse to do their job. Never even getting it to a jury trial.
I wonder if you're talking about insight. Like, insight is a form of intelligence, and you can't teach somebody to have insight. And I don't think the public understands that doctors, lawyers, detectives, police officers, therapists, nobody's sussing out insight or maturity level at all. And if you don't have insight, you don't have insight. It takes insight to be able to look at things and connect them. That's why we have quotes from people like Einstein that said, I'll botch it, but that say something like intelligence is being able to make however many connections, like being able to make connections. when you have insight, to me, it's a no-brainer. You absolutely see that incestuous quality to sexual abuse, to hurting the very people you're tasked with caring for. And then this is exactly the same thing. It's just minus the sexual element, but it is
Right.
certainly incestuous. It is certainly within the realm of the very system where abuse is not supposed to happen, where you are supposed to be in your safe container of security and people wishing the very best for you. Not,
You have the compulsiveness, you have the,
yep,
the manipulation of adults around the child just for a
Yep.
different purpose. I mean,
grooming,
the
both are
grooming,
groomed.
you have grooming as a child gets
Yep.
older for sure.
Yep.
And to participate in the abuse. Yeah, it matches up perfectly with sexual abuse, but that just goes to show you how some people will deny and deny and deny, either for a political agenda or because they don't want to do the work.
Or because they have it in their family. And you'll never know, but you can tell if you hit somebody's button. I've felt it on podcasts, actually. I've had multiple people go, no, I don't want you to share your story like that. I'm like, really? You sure did a whole lot of Me Too stuff back in the day, but I can't share my story. No, people don't want to hear that. Okay. All right. And I can tell sometimes I hit the button and I'm like, is it you? Is it your brother? Is it your dad? Who is it? Because you don't have that kind of, no, we're going to pretend like that's not.
It's so funny. When I was a DA investigator, we would, a lot of our trials were sexual abuse trials. And in jury selection, they would ask. And, the judge was always like, does anyone need to, if anyone has any sexual abuse history, you can, if you have anything you want to tell me, you can ask to speak with me in private. And yeah, we would have people oftentimes just stand up in court. And the first time they've ever told anyone they were sexually abused is in front of 60 jury members.
Wow. It is one of the most underreported, underestimated things. And then the last 20 years with what's happened with online porn and the internet, child sexual abuse is out of control. And people do not want to deal with that reality too. And I know, because you're in Texas. I was in Texas for a while. Sex trafficking capital of our country, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's not my expertise.
Oh,
but,
it's part of mine.
I mean, we're on the border, so there you go.
Yep. Border and then ports.
Yeah.
Yep. That's where it happens. And so people just want to pretend that things are better than they are. What I think about often is how certain professionals are mandatory reporters. And I would challenge every adult out there that because you're an adult, you're a mandatory reporter.
Well, in some states, in Texas,
Florida, everyone's a mandatory reporter.
Texas, same way.
Yeah, I don't know that. I don't know how prosecutable it would be if you were.
But that's the right message.
I think so. And I think like a couple of things I wanted to add to what you're saying. I mean, normally, first of all, on the concept of reporting, it's why I think this really first big important step, with the show, with the book, is awareness, right? Is teaching people what to look for, what specifically sort of like how to even form a way to report, right? But more than just like sort of, I have a bad feeling that something's wrong. Like being like, this is a specific form of abuse that I can report. Like even getting there is a big first step, because I think, and that children are a community project, right? I think children are the responsibility of the community. And I think their parents primarily, of course, but and this is a place where we have a lot of ideological difference in this country about where, what should, how involved should these other adults be in your child's life. And as a parent, I feel strongly that I want my children to be, I would want other people in the community to look out for my kids, right? It's not possible to be with your kids all the time. It's not healthy to be with your kids all the time and be the only adults they see.
I agree.
So I think, with that, we all need to have our eyes open. And I would just encourage, especially people who work with kids, but if you have kids, you're going to be around a lot of other people around a lot of other kids, to not look the other way. Kids are depending on you. Kids are very, very vulnerable. They
need your courage.
They need your courage. And even if it something that I want to tell people, because I think it can be very discouraging to tell people to report this form of abuse in particular, although this is not only this form of abuse. You certainly hear this in other forms of abuse where so often by the time something gets to courts, it's like, oh, there's been 8 CPS reports. And this is, it's not, again, it's not subtle, right? It's not a first time thing. So I know there can be a lot of frustrations with reporting, but what I want to tell people about, as we're really getting to know, through the nonprofit that I founded, now our colleague Bjorker runs, I'm still on the board of Munchausen support, which we do support groups for, one of the main projects of that we're working on also like research and training and all these other things. But one of the main things we do there is these peer support groups for survivors, for dads who've been through cases, for grandparents. We're starting one for doctors because the doctors really go through it in these cases. But is that we have heard from a lot more survivors than this is not a population that has been studied. Again, one of our colleagues, Dr. Kathy Ayub, who I mentioned earlier in the call from Harvard, is doing a long-term study about survivors of Munchausen by proxy abuse, but that data is not yet available. But this is not a population that's been paid much attention to because people don't recognize this form of abuse enough to sort of recognize that this is a population, period. But as we've gotten to know more of those survivors and heard from them, and the only survivor I know who was actually separated from her abuser is Alyssa Wayburn, who was on the show, and that is the sheriff's daughter, and Mike was working that case. But other than that, I don't know very many other, a couple of, I guess, the Barr kids and George's kids, but other than cases that involved Mike Weber, the other survivors I know were all raised by their abusers. But even then, they remember the people who stood up for them.
Yes.
They remember the doctors who tried. They remember the teachers who tried. We had this, we went with a survivor on their journey in season 4, and we went back to their hometown and they sat with like their first grade teacher and, their childhood pediatrician. And it was just incredibly moving. And that means something to them. That means that an adult saw them, that they saw what was happening to them, and that they thought their life was worth something. They thought that they were worth protecting.
Yes.
And like, that is not a small thing. And the other thing that we know, even when these cases go badly, which one of the cases, as you will see in the book, does not have the outcome that we would have hoped for. Even then, or, in my sister's case, that case did not have the outcome that we would hope for. She got her kids back. And I feel like in both of those cases, the interventions of the doctors and the other people who were courageous enough to intervene saved those kids' life. And that, slowed the abuse down. That intervention put more eyes on the kids. Like, those interventions still matter. They can mean the difference between life and death, and they are still worth doing. And so even if it is frustrating, even if you are nervous about it, it's never comfortable to report on someone. No one likes report. I mean, this idea that like doctors or anybody else are out there sort of like looking for abuse to report on, like that's just not, that's not how anybody spends their day. It's very uncomfortable. It's horrible for doctors to have to report abuse because it's also like, if you talk about sort of the ways in which this violates the sort of contract of what we think of as motherhood, right? Like, I mean, for doctors, it's a whole other contract that they've built their life around, which is the ability, like the ability to trust a parent. Like, doctors' entire profession, more or less, I mean, most things are clinical diagnoses. Like, most things are not, blood tests and black and white in doctors. Like, doctors are by and large, very sort of curious, open-minded people, and they have to be able to trust parents are telling them the truth. And when that's violated, that's horrible for them on a whole bunch of levels. And then beyond that, to think that they have been used as a tool to abuse a child, it's horrible. So nobody likes doing this, but it's so, so important, especially in this abuse, because it does have a high death rate.
Yes. Yes. And I'm going to add that to what Andrea is saying. It's not just about the ways that we want to save kids in the acute way of, okay, we want CPS involved. We want them removed from the home. Those things that people say to kids, they save lives in terms of those kids don't commit suicide.
Yeah.
Because they don't have a lot to hold on to. And when someone steps up and out for them, that does give, like you said, Andrea, this message of you matter. I'm willing to be uncomfortable for you, which means that you matter. You have worth. And that can be the difference between somebody suiciding as a teenager or young adult versus staying here.
Yeah.
My family doctor was the first one when I was a teenager to walk in the room when I drove myself. And she looked at me and said, "You must be adopted, right?" And it was the first person to ever acknowledge something is really wrong in your family. And she didn't know exactly what it was, but she sure knew something was wrong. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, you have such a different energy than your mom and dad. They badger me. They are trying to get meds. They were med shopping and doing that type of thing. And she could just tell. And she would have me come after school to see her when I was very, very depressed, just to come to her office as she was closing up her office, just to chat with me. She steadied me. I had teachers that did that. You cannot know the weight and power of a moment with a child that's being abused. A moment that will be so inconsequential to you, but maybe the difference between that kid holding on to life or not.
That's really beautiful, Nikki. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And that is so in line with kind of what we've heard from survivors and their memories of adults that were around them. And I just also like an encouraging thing, I think, for people that work with kids of like, yeah, even if it's not going to end up in a separation and that kid be, like in this sort of ideal thing that probably is not going to happen, right? I mean, unfortunately, with the systems we currently have, and it's unlikely, but I think, just reinforcing, like, I would think, if you have someone in your life, if you're working with kids and you're a teacher, or you're a coach, or even like a pediatrician or a doctor, like just being a person that gives some different messaging to that kid can be really powerful. So like, telling that kid that they're capable, and telling that kid, being encouraging, or just even giving them a break to like talk about anything other than their illness, right? I mean, that's the thing, is like, what's really heartbreaking about this abuse is that it just decimates someone's identity, and it decimates their ability to connect with their own body. So I think being just a voice, other than that, of just being like, yeah, like what else, what else can you talk to
And
that
to
kid about?
trust.
What are, yeah, and like,
And to trust the
yeah,
betrayal of
the
your own
betrayal, yeah,
parent poisoning you
yeah,
and abusing you, to be able to then go out into the world and
yeah,
trust that random people that you didn't come out of their body are going to love you and take care of you and frankly treat you right. Psychologically, that's such a hurdle to get over when your own parent abuses you. So if you have somebody in your life that you think was severely abused, just be a steady Eddie for them. Be the person that if they get upset around you or they show you their anger, that you go, yeah, cool, you got your anger out. Yeah, I love you. Like, just be a steady Eddie and hold some space. We are surrounded by so many people that go through hard things, just like Mike said, that it might take one moment of just even being pulled into a jury, because that might be the first moment in that person's life somebody says, hey, did anything happen to you? Do you need to say anything about this? You go all the years of your life with nobody saying that to you until that moment. And that's when it comes up and out. So we are holding space for people constantly, and we don't even know it, who are going through difficult things.
yeah, yeah. And I think too, like, just as kind of like final thought on it, vis-a-vis this abuse, and I think in a bigger context as well, like, I just really, I encourage people to approach it with openness and curiosity, right? Like, I think one of the ways in which, the true crime genre can be pretty problematic, and that's like a whole other conversation. But I think, like, the reason that this show has found an audience is because people are very curious about this phenomenon, right? There's a ton of just interest in why do people do these things. And I don't think it's wrong to be compelled by it or curious about it. And I think that's a good thing. Because we're all interested in why people, especially when people do these sort of like really, divergent behaviors. We're all curious about that. And I think just be open to learning about it, right? And accept that there's a lot of things that society doesn't have a handle on yet, or doesn't understand until they do. And so I think folks in the media, in particular, like, just have some curiosity about it. Just ask the questions, really dig in. And honestly, like, I think sometimes people assume about me that because of the lens that I come through, and I never pretend that I don't have the perspective that I do, right? That's why it was so important to me to talk about what had happened in my family to sort of disclose that. But like, I always go in with curiosity. I always go into a case being like, all right, if there's some other explanation for what happened here than abuse, I want to find it. And trust me when I tell you that I would be the person to find it, because I will be the most thorough. I will ask all of those questions.
That's a fact.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. You know, like, I will do the deepest deep dive. I will read like, I will talk to anybody who will talk to me. Like, I am so curious. And I actually, like, I am sort of on a mission to find a false accusation. I have not yet. None of I think our colleagues have seen one thing that they considered that actually went through the court to the point of a separation that was a misdiagnosis. There's like one case, and it was very, very complicated. But like, it's really I would like to find one, because I would like to see what that even looks like in one of these cases. So I am the most curious. I am the most open. Because I want to know everything about this. And so I would just encourage people to like not make assumptions. And like, if you hear about a case where someone is presenting it as a false accusation, ask some questions, you know, and especially if you're a reporter, for heaven's sake, like, ask all the questions. That is literally your job. But I think especially, you know, for judges, for legal, and unfortunately we've seen the least interest. I've seen there's been a lot of interest in sort of training and learning more from medical professionals, from folks who work with child abuse, you know, survivors, from those organizations, from social workers, from law enforcement. We've seen a ton of interest. Not a lot of interest from judges, not a lot of interest from attorneys. So we really need the legal profession to step up here. Not zero, right? We've had some, and there's some folks on the committee that have that background, but like, have some curiosity about it. Like, nobody knows everything about everything. So like, be open to learning about it, because that's the best way that you're going to protect kids.
Do you think the block there is, I don't want to be the lawyer or the judge known for being hard on moms? Like, is that the basic block?
I think it's more pragmatic. I think they see these as hard cases to win, and so they just don't. That's been I'll put it, that's been my personal experience with it.
Yeah.
It's just easier to say, well, we're just not going to try this. We're just going to dismiss it.
Yeah, I think that's something that until I was working with Mike, and until I didn't know, you know, again, speaking to like me having a very privileged life in general, that I'd never had any interactions with really the legal system before this. And now I've had several, mostly on the sort of defamation and lawsuit threats side of things. But yeah, I mean, before I was really digging into these cases, I had no awareness of the fact that, like, you can have a case where there's really strong evidence, and that, you know, the law enforcement has done their job, and then it just gets passed off to a prosecutor, and they're kind of like, you know, thumbs up or thumbs down, and that decision is just made by people like sitting at a desk, you know, looking at things, and a lot of times evaluating. Right. I don't think people know that. I think that we have that, like, more faith in our justice system maybe than we should. And just this idea that, like, you know, I was talking to a retired prosecutor who's local the other day about just sort of these cases and why they go wrong. And it's really, again, I think I think part of it is, I think there probably is some of that thing of like, people don't want to go against moms in court. I think that probably could be true. I think the bigger reason is, like, there's expense that, you know, to hiring experts, and like, these are, you know, more complicated trials, especially if the offender has money and they are able to hire.
There's not as much precedent.
Right. And nobody wants to set legal professionals, a lot of them, you know, don't want to set legal precedent. So there isn't much legal precedent in these cases. And then just, you know, is it going to be a W or an L, right? Like, I think there's just that thing of, like, prosecutors' offices, like, don't often like to go into something unless they think it's a slam dunk, and which, again, I think is something that people really do not realize. And these cases are quite complicated in court. You don't know if the judge is going to know anything or the jury is going to know anything. It's, you know, you're going to be subpoenaing all these different records and having this doctor say this and that doctor say that. It's very easy to position these cases as doctor versus doctor, even if that is, like, really not the case, or that's not, you know, that's not the truth of it. So there are a lot of reasons that these just are not juicy. And also, like, there might not be anybody that actually, you know, it's not a case where there might be a lot of political will on, you know, to prosecute, right? It's, and like,
DA's offices are political offices.
Right. So it's like, well, what it's going to be the pressure on us not to just drop this, right? Like, where is there going to be an outcry other than from Mike and Andrea. If we drop
Right. The kids, the child is not going to say anything.
Kid's not going to go to the media.
Right.
Yep.
In fact, even if the media did talk to the kid, i.e. the Maya Kowalski case, where that father felt just seemingly absolutely perfectly comfortable to exploit the heck out of his children by putting them in the media while they were underage to defend his position as the plaintiff in that case, right? Suing the hospital after his wife died by suicide during the investigation. Child victims frequently defend their abusers. That is across the board in a case that is part of the manipulation. Anybody who works with these populations understands that. I don't know that the general public does. So like, you're not going to get an outcry. A lot of times the family members, the spouses support the abuser. So like, who's the outcry coming from? Like literally who's standing up for that kid?
Well, and Andrea, a great example I have is going back to the Benadryl poisoning case and Derek Jones. When Derek first met with the prosecutor, he tried to talk him into a 5-year deferred probation sentence for that mom. And this is a poisoning case. This is, I mean, and she had also convinced her 11-year-old that her 11-year-old had epilepsy her whole life, and she didn't. She was drugging all of her kids. And I don't think that particular prosecutor or most know how to evaluate these cases because they haven't seen them. They don't know what they're worth. They don't know how to try them. And I think it scares them. And I think they're going to make whatever deal they think they can, depending on the prosecutor, not all of them, but if you have someone that's intimidated by this topic or this amount of evidence that I'm going to give them, because I'm going to give them a ton, the easy way out is to plea it. And even after she did everything she did, when it came down to the sentencing hearing, the prosecution only asked for 20 years. The judge gave her 60. Maybe you don't know how to evaluate these cases properly when that happens.
Well, and Mike, you made this point in the book, that, and this was a light bulb moment for me that, and like, again, this is not a nefarious thing, just a human thing that like prosecutors are lawyers and they're often going to have, relationships with the defense attorneys in these cases, and they're going to listen to those people. And, I've seen what the defense attorneys say in these cases. And so that defense attorney is coming in there and saying like, this is outrageous. You've separated this sick child from their mom. And look, they have these, they were only doing what the doctors told them to do. And it's like, if you don't have a high level of like, if you don't have an understanding of this abuse, like that's pretty persuasive. And so they're sort of being told like, they're getting a lot of like maybe signaling from people that they trust that this case is going to be a disaster in court. So like, there's a lot of, they're very disincentivized in like in a whole bunch of ways, I think.
Right. And like, look, we went to experienced prosecutor's office, being a very inexperienced prosecutor's office really quickly when a bunch of people left during an administration change. And our defense bar went from being, because, what are prosecutors going to do? They're going to go be defense attorneys and make more money. So then we had all those prosecutors go to the defense, and we had a very good defense bar then. And we had very inexperienced prosecutors, which still persists to this day. And so you have people handling things that they really shouldn't be handling at the point in their career that they're at, but yet they're tasked with this job. And it's not like I'm dealing with a 15 or 20 year veteran of the DA's office. I'm dealing with someone who has 4 or 5 years experience, maybe.
People don't know what they don't know. I think there's something happening culturally too. I think probably my field is in large part to blame. We've had such a swing from so much mental health being stigmatized about 20 years ago to no stigma to compassion. Something has happened that I'm super upset about, because it seems like my field has pushed for compassion when it comes to mental health, which somehow has devolved into my compassion must mean that you don't have consequences. Instead of, I have compassion for you and here are all of your consequences. And I do think that there are judges, there are DA's offices, there are prosecutors that are playing into this cultural wave of compassion means letting people get away with things. Instead of no, compassion means that I have compassion. I have empathy for how hard life is and whatever got you to this point, to these behaviors. But none of my feelings about you get you out of your consequences. So I think that has to be in play too.
you'll see articles on this abuse where all they talk about is mom's mental health. The word child abuse never appears in the article. It's all about mom's mental health. And I'm like, why are you focusing on the abuser and not the child?
That's what I mean about the DSM. I don't
yeah.
think we're doing justice separating sociopathy from depression. There's no person on earth that isn't a sociopath that is going to get depressed enough to fully hurt a child. And psychosis is overplayed. Psychosis is not subtle.
Right. And that's actually something that I always like, we talk a lot about the sort of the diagnosis for the psychopathology on the show. And I presented actually last week or the week before last at the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law, and presented with Dr. Jim Hamilton, who's a fantastic expert who's now at Yale. And he was talking about, well, we've talked a lot about the sort of the utility of having a diagnosis for this behavior in the DSM, and like what that is, what that's really like, how that is helpful or not helpful. And I think one of the big ways it's not helpful is that gets brought up sometimes as like a defense in court. And also just it gets it gets sort of siloed in this thing of like, oh, well, you have to have, bring in a psychiatrist, do an evaluation, and then sit down and then, okay, they have it or they don't have it, which is just completely not the right way to look at it. And it gets, as you said, Nikki, like very divorced from the harm that person is doing to their child. And what he said, which was really a great thing, is like, I would like to see like, okay, if this is a diagnosis, right? Because like the purpose of the DSM, and Nikki, you would know a lot more about this than I do, but a big thing it's used for, which I think people don't, number one, it's not a perfect text, right? It's why it's updated. There's a lot of things
talk about it like it is.
Homosexuality used to also be in the DSM. Like it's not like, not everything is, is sort of a diagnosable pathology. And sort of like, I think the big questions around the psychiatric diagnosis of factious disorder imposed on another, which is the official name for it in the DSM, is like, okay, how treatable is it? And like, who is getting diagnosed? This is a diagnostic manual. Who is getting diagnosed with this? Virtually no one, because it's never diagnosed in the absence of usually like a criminal conviction, where someone is then mandated to seek mental health care for this diagnosis. But it's not something that people seek a diagnosis for, right? So
same for narcissism, same for sociopathy. It's only if they're
same for
forced
pedophilia.
into the system. Right. Pedophilia too. Absolutely.
Right. It's because you've ended up in the system. And so I think that there's really a lot there. And I think like really we just need to center like, okay, as a prosecutor, as a doctor, as a social worker, you're not a psychiatrist, like don't worry about it. Your job is to determine, is this person harming their children? And again, that central question, is this a person that can provide a safe home for a child? The reasons don't matter, right? Even if someone is in psychosis, which I think is like, again, not hard to tell the difference. I think, again, there's this sort of like, there's this veil of this being difficult to diagnose. There are other reasons that a parent might over medicalize their child. It could be because they're anxious. It could be because they're having psychosis. Now, if someone's in postpartum psychosis or they're having delusions, that is usually very obvious, right? That's a very distinguishable behavior.
It's a snapping. If
right. It's not a
something
pattern
out of
behavior, that goes all the way back for like decades, which in this case, in cases of Munchausen by proxy, it does. And then in the anxiety thing, then you might see some of these parental behaviors that are like exaggerated, but still kind of in the spectrum of like normal stuff, right? Like, oh, this person's taking their kid to the doctor too much, but they're just like an anxious parent, which is something a lot of parents can relate to, especially like on your first kid. Like every time they sneeze, you're like, blah, are they going to die? So, I think that's like, there's a spectrum there. And then, if someone like is overly anxious and they're over medicalizing their child, that still causes harm, but that's an easier problem to fix. That parent needs more support. You need to have someone else that's like involved in the medical care. And like that parent is usually not going to resist that to the same degree. You don't see people systematically lying to doctors, researching conditions on their computer, poisoning their children because of those reasons, right? So it is actually like pretty easy to distinguish at the end of the day.
Oh, thank y'all so much for coming on and having this talk.
Thank you for having us, Nikki. It's really, you asked great questions and had great insights that I shall carry along with me.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm going to push your book everywhere I can. It comes out in January.
February, actually.
February. It comes out in February 5th. Okay. We will make sure that we coordinate this release with that release. Thank y'all so very much. So if people want to find you, where can they find y'all and your work?
So for me, you can find my podcast, Nobody Should Believe Me, anywhere you listen to podcasts. And then you can find other information about me at my website, andreadunlop.net.
And Mike?
And for me, you can find me at Mike Weber Consulting, Weber with one B, .com. And I provide training on this topic to law enforcement, CPS, pretty much any discipline that touches this abuse. I provide training to. And it's from what to do when this lands on your desk all the way to criminal and through criminal prosecution.
Thank you so much for all the work you have done, all of your career.
Sure, I appreciate that.
I want to thank Andrea Dunlop and Mike Weber for being willing to have such a candid conversation, for being people out in the world that also are willing to step in and up and ask the really hard questions, even when it makes people uncomfortable, towards the advocacy of children. Children don't have their voices. We are their voices. It takes a village. We are their community. We can be powerful when we don't pretend like abuse isn't happening in our communities. Please take care of yourselves and each other. Light and love. Get the book, The Mother Next Door, and listen to Andrea and Mike on No One Should Believe Me, and tune in next week for a brand new episode of Emotional Badass. I am an emotional badass. You are an emotional badass. And together, we are where Moxie meets mindful. Bye-bye.